my very good friend here in Sweden, Niels Carlson, who wrote a book called Reviving Classical Liberalism Against Populism. And he explicitly says there that populism is the, he says in various works, he maybe doesn't use this quote in that book, but that populism is bad. He defines it as bad. And he has said populism is the antithesis of classical liberalism. Populism is the opposite of classical liberalism. Well, Niels, I'm sorry, I don't get this. And it's by defining populism in a certain way, I would say an idiosyncratic way, so that he builds bad into it. Another person who I engage and who is prominent here and comes from Reason Magazine and such is Shika Dalmia, who runs the website Substack The Unpopulist. And she's the same. So she and Niels are kind of my classical liberal friends who are popuphobes. They're promoting popuphobia. Governmentalization is a sham and a menace by and large. And leftism is more governmentalization of social affairs. They're in denial about that. They're also in denial about how governmentalization sucks, like how bad it sucks and how like reliably it sucks. But that's what I believe. So many places around the world among the leftists and the globalists, they're raping democracy in so many places. This fits into, the whole regime change, deep state. What's happened in Romania recently? You heard about that?
I missed it.
This is my understanding. I'm pretty confident about it, that this guy Georgescu was poised to win. He's like against the globalist Project Ukraine type stuff, which is super important for that whole project. I think NATO plans its biggest military base in Romania, and he was going to win. And so a court there said the election's canceled because of Russian interference on TikTok, which was just total bullshit. Is known.
It's amazing how these bad ideas get retreaded all.
Exactly. It's the same. It's the same like really Russia, cool. Go to Russia, evil Russia, Russia. Hunter Biden laptop, everything else. And they tried regime change operation recently in Georgia, but for the moment that's failed. They're now working, they're working all over the place. And they're raping democracy in the name of protecting democracy. Because, Russia was interfering on TikTok.
Hi, everybody. I'm honored today to have Professor Dan Klein with us. He is the Professor of Economics and the JIN Chair at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he leads a program in Adam Smith. He is a friend of mine and a fellow at the Brownstone Institute and a writer there. He's got lucid writing. I have been coming up with this new word for some people like clairvoyant, which means not so much looking in the future, a little bit of that, but clear seeing. And Dan is someone who does that. We're going to maybe repurpose that word, just as liberalism has been repurposed, as he's written about as well. So Dan is a man of liberal ideas in a sense, but in terms of freedom. And there's a lot of political streams going around, and one of them often decried and defamed is populism. And Dan has at least one cheer for populism, perhaps more. And I'm going to maybe pop up his article in a second. But Dan, tell us, how many cheers for populism should we have?
I titled it "One Cheer for Populism," but maybe, especially in this day and age, 2.
Oh, you're up to 2. Well, that's good. How many stars do you give your Uber drivers? Just curious.
I'm not so. I give them tips. I don't give them stars.
Oh, okay. Well, just it's kind of an interesting parsimony, or a kind of a reverse, I suppose, generosity of stars and ratings. When you
Mhm.
watch the Olympics, and nobody gets like lower than a 9.3. If I,
Mm.
if I were
Well,
skating,
cheers are out of three, right? I mean, three is the top
yeah,
for
right. So three
cheers.
cheers.
Yeah.
So one cheer for populism. Does that mean that you're lukewarm about populism, or you're this is the first out of ABC, a
The
list of
main
cheers for
the
populism?
main impetus was to say why populism can be good and to push back against people who say that populism is inherently bad.
Mhm.
Yeah. Let me tell you how I read what's going on. I think that populism, the word populism, is a bit of another bit of gas in the gaslight that's going on, broadly speaking, by the globalists, the blob, the left pots, whatever we want to call the whole kind of skein of things that are kind of allied, and in our context in the United States, I think have been especially allied with the Dems lately. Um, so populism is a bit of gas in the gaslight, just like mis and disinformation is gas in the gaslight. I'm borrowing from James Howard Kunstler, by the way, when I use that. I borrow that gas in the gaslight. I love that.
Mhm.
Just like this kind of bullshit terms. Um, and they revile populism, just as you were saying. And they revile Trump and Bolsonaro and Orban, Farage, and so on.
Malay.
Um, Millet, but Millet's a funny one and a real problem. And I wrote a whole piece called Popuphobia's Javier Millet Problem. Because popuphobia is the people, are the classical liberals who denounce and revile populism. But then there's Javier Millet. It's like, hey, how can you not like that, right? And he is widely called a populist. Like all the mainstream media have called him populist. And in the definition that I put forward, I think he clearly qualifies as a populist. And he proves, maybe better than definitely better than anyone else, that populism can be good, can work to the good. And so, how do they deal with this? They try to ignore it, I would say, for the most part, or they try to kind of explain it away by suggesting that maybe he's not that classical liberal, or by suggesting that maybe he's not really a populist. But I think that's, bullshit, basically. You don't mind
Right.
me talking that way, I
No,
trust.
no, no. So a definition of terms. What is
Yeah.
populism?
Okay. So before I get into my definition of populism, let me give a little more background about the blob and the gas and the gaslight, because I just want to connect to Michael Benz and his whole, scheme about the blob and the deep state. The deep state, he sees it as very much a foreign policy establishment thing, and he talks about defense and CIA and state as kind of the core institutions of the blob. And then, yeah, that's a picture I used in another thing. And then they have all this, and they connect. So they're in the blob there. That's the quotation marks mean I'm quoting Benz there, and that's state, intelligence community and DOD. But you can kind of mix that with the administrative state and politicians, maybe call all that the swamp. And then they all work their clientelism, as I call it. That's my terminology. Um, Through these are now segments as divided by Benz, all these institutions to work their whole bag of, thought effery, if you will, which is propaganda, censorship, persecution, and this clientelism, intimidation running throughout all of it. And so part of their propaganda is to revile their opponents, people who threaten them in some way. And a big term here of revilement is populism. So, and partly of how they do this is that they say populism is a threat to democracy. And as Ben say, when you ask them, what do you mean by democracy? They mean democracy is the New York Times. Democracy is, the Gates Foundation. Democracy is the UN, is the WHO. So they define themselves as democracy. And so if you're against democracy, so defined, you're an enemy of democracy, and they're calling populism that. Now, what really struck, I mean, this was just more gas in the gaslight as I saw it. But what really has shocked me, as many things have shocked me in the last few years, among my classical liberal friends and colleagues, is that some of them joined in on this, that is to say, in reviling populism. And among those are my very good friend here in Sweden, Niels Carlson, who wrote a book called Reviving Classical Liberalism Against Populism. And he explicitly says there that populism is he says in various works, he maybe doesn't use this quote in that book, but that populism is bad. He defines it as bad. And he has said populism is the antithesis of classical liberalism. Populism is the opposite of classical liberalism. Well, Niels, I'm sorry, I don't get this. And it's by defining populism in a certain way, I would say an idiosyncratic way, so that he builds bad into it. Another person who I engage and who is prominent here and comes from Reason Magazine and such is Shika Dalmia, who runs the website Substack The Unpopulist. And she's the same. So she and Niels are kind of my classical liberal friends who are popuphobes. They're promoting popuphobia. And what really upsets me about this, I mean, it's kind of like, to me, seems like kind of like intellectually wanting. But what really upsets me about it is it plays into the hands of the bad guys in that picture, right? And it all is part of them being, like, I think, misguided about lesser evil in politics and being kind of Trump derangement syndrome and so on. And I don't really get why people are like that, frankly, but that's the context and what moved me to write these articles. So with that said, I then say, look, if populism has a coherent and useful definition, what is it? And I say, and I think this is reasonable, that it's a style of politics, like for a political movement, for a leader of a political movement, just like we see in people calling these leaders populists, where the leaders and the movement are decrying corrupt elites, especially government elites and their network and clients around them, as abusing their kind of power, basically, at the wider expense of the country, the people, and they propose to promote politicians who go opposite of that, or somehow against that, or have some other idea. Now, that's neither necessarily good or bad, the populist movement and the populist leader. It all depends on, if the establishment and the elites are really terrible and corrupt, and what the populist will later, if they succeed, do with power. Okay, I would say that what they do with power is not itself part of the definition of populism. So populism could be good if its policies are good, and it could be bad if the populists get in and do things that are bad. But it's entirely possible that it's better than, what's been happening and what the elites are generally doing. And I think that's true for Trump versus the alternative. I think that's true for Milei versus the alternative. I think it's true for Bolsonaro versus Lula, and so on. So I think it's really terrible that so many classical liberals have, I don't know why, but played along, and I would say been played by almost, the real bigger threat to freedom and Western civilization, which is the deep state and so forth. Does all that make kind of sense?
Yes. I tend to see it as a kind of a monarchical system. There's the king and his courtiers. the people on the in, because no offense to you economists, but oddly enough, economists, most of them who are professional economists, I don't know, but you'll tell me the most part, but a good number of them are academicians, and thus they are working as sinecure. They have tenure. They have to be part of the system. They're not free.
Mhm.
They're not free range. Kind of ball bearing lubricated parts of the big machine we have as society. Their production is thought. And people, maybe they do or don't need ice cream. Maybe they do or don't Uber lifts. Maybe they do or don't need lacrosse sticks. But they kind of further down the list is economic thought as far as what people think they need on an individual basis. And so there has to be kind of a created need. And in order to have that, you need a society of people who value and respect that. So that's, I think, the bulwark of what's called kind of classical liberalism, or bien pensant, the good thinking people of society. So that's in the court. And so everything that is there, once it's there, in order to reduce cognitive dissonance, if you start as a classical liberal and now you're part of the system, which is, say, monarchical, you have to kind of relabel that system monarchical. Otherwise, you have violated your own precepts. So I think we all have our, kind of bitter pill to swallow. And once we do, there's a little bit less of turning back. And so, if you could invert somehow the model of how we can, economists, proffer their goods and sell them, according to an actual real economy, you might have economists that believe in the actual real economies. So as something different from something that is just there to keep their jobs and their tickets and so forth. So I think it's the rare economist, the rare lawyer, the rare physician, as we saw during COVID and whatever, who will step out from the groupthink, because frankly we are comfortable as herds because herds are more powerful.
I've thought a lot. I gather that you're kind of taking a stab at explaining why some of these associates of mine, classical liberals, are popuphobes.
Yes.
Am I right? Yeah. Yeah, I follow you. And it's not just academics. It's also the policy community, the government itself, journalism, foundations, and so forth.
Yeah,
and if they're they're all dominantly left, and it could be, and I don't think it's conscious or cynical or conniving, but it could be that they've kind of fallen too much into thinking they're more, I don't know, they don't see the danger. They don't really see this monstrosity for what it is fully, it seems to me. And they've kind of fallen into the culture, just like almost everybody in the Beltway to some extent. Even the classical liberals, I think, are infected by this. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to just throw one quote out in there. H.L. Mencken, an imperfect individual, but a really great quote generator, along with Winston Churchill and whatnot, Mark Twain, perhaps. He said, democracy is the principle by which the people vote for what they want, and they deserve to get it good and hard. So I think it's kind of the idea of populism, oftentimes for those already in power, is to twist it so they can bludgeon themselves back into power. I use the example of Boris Johnson, I think, who came on a populist wave of Brexit, and then he had a double dose. Frankly, he had he had a booster, as Dr. Fauci would call it, of a second election that gave him even more populist. And he had to just do that one thing that people wanted, and he watered it down.
Yeah.
He became corrupted. Some people, my British friends say it's from his I don't know, his paramour, whatever, his girlfriend or current wife or mother of his most recent kid, whatever. And she's an uber leftist, and he just kind of I don't know, withered away, and we're left with I guess the big state in the UK, doing its kind of quasi-Stalinist best to maintain itself. So,
he's an example of bad populism. I mean, he had a populist period, you could say, and he turned out not to be good. He turned out to be terrible, in fact, I would say.
Yeah.
But
So
that doesn't mean that all populism is to the bad at all. It's not inherently bad. And Millet proves that. Like he's the best example of it
mhm,
not being bad. Even the Cato Institute and so on are now like celebrating Millet. And so when I bring this up and push this, again, I don't think they deal with it at all competently. They just try to like ignore it for the most part. They don't really engage this obvious challenge of you say that good populists can't exist. Here is one like right here, center of the table.
mhm.
Like, what do you have to say about it? And I think he's clearly highly classical liberal. Also, I could quote headlines from the Washington Post. This is from one of my articles: Washington Post, New York Times, Associated Press, NPR, PBS, Politico, The Guardian, The Economist, France 24, all calling him populist, Malay populist. So it's like, well, and if you look at his campaign and his rhetoric about the caste, the political caste system in Argentina, I mean, he's totally against the elites and the establishment. He did not come from like a traditional established party. Uh, so he's got all the markers of populism, I would say, and he's good. So there you go. And I think you could make the same case actually for some of the other people, maybe just not as starkly. I think the cases there, it's very hard to know what's true and what's not true, but I think people too much believe like the propaganda against people like Bolsonaro
Mhm.
and Orban.
Absolutely. No, then they believe propaganda. I have. Well, I'm going to skip over that anecdote. Is El Salvador's? Let's see, get his name right. I think his name
Bukele.
is Pele. Is he a populist? And how have things panned out in El Salvador for the people? I mean, the root of populism, frankly, of politics, is the people, public, all that kind of stuff. All those words refer to
Mhm.
people. And should the people, after all, it's a democracy, I guess, or constitutional republic, or whatever we have from place to place. Do the people, and frankly, the word republic has public in it as well. So there's
Mhm.
all these things. The Democrats and the Republicans all have the root word of people in it. Demos is the people. Republic is the reformed around the
Mhm.
people. Do the
Yeah.
people deserve stuff? Or I mean, who are they and which people?
Yeah. That's right. So the idea that populism is necessarily bad just seems so fundamentally unworkable for the reasons you say. It's not that different. The whole essence of it isn't that different from these other things that, the good of the people. I mean, how can that be bad? The good of the whole. That's ethics right there. That's Christianity, for God's sakes. That's, monotheism, the good of the whole. And the whole is like mankind, humankind. Like, how is that? That's the people. It's not that tricky, right? So I also want to say a little bit about charisma, Randy. Should I go into that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think this is kind of interesting, and it's something I treat in what I see like my main article on this topic, which is One Cheer for Populism, which appeared in Fusion, and I make use of Max Weber, Economy and Society. He died at the age of 56 in 1920, and this came out posthumously through the work of his wife. Sometime later, it's considered, I think, one of his greatest works, along with the Protestant Ethic book. And he in this talks about three sources of legitimacy. And I think these sources pertain to this whole analysis and understanding of populism nicely. The first kind of source, and kind of his main one, is actually, if you will, the administrative state, like the established bureaucracy, the governing institutions, the norms of those, not the personalities, but the rules, the procedures, the habits, and that is always like this very strong conservative force. It's also obviously tends to be an acquisitive and engulfing thing, just like Tocqueville talked about. Once centralization tends to promote centralization. So that's his first one. And then he talks about two other sources of legitimacy. So there's like legitimacy now. Think of it as a political leader or political movement that the leader's leading. If you're going to be, well, the other two sources come out of the personality of the leader of a movement. Okay. And there's then two versions of that. One is tradition, that the personality is, let's say, like an astronaut or a famous general, like an Eisenhower or something, a George Washington, who represents some kind of tradition, religious, creedal, patriotic. It could be organizational in some other ways, like a political party and a political philosophy associated with a party, where that's just like a very established standard bearer, and it's part of his personality, and that can actually stand up and try to compete with the first source of legitimacy, the institutions, the state, if you will. But the other one is charisma, where just something about, the particular personality of the individual is winning to people and appealing to people. And I definitely think you should associate this with Donald Trump, because he's obviously was a celebrity by virtue of his native charisma before he got into politics at all. And so charisma is the other way in which personality can work as legitimacy. And what's interesting is the relationship, which I think is strong, but not 100% necessary or sufficient, of this charisma with populism. If a leader's populist, it means that that leader is going against those very established institutions, right? That's what's corrupt. Mm-hmm. That's what they're complaining about. That's what they're riling people up about and proposing to reform. And so they can't very well draw their legitimacy from that. And so they have to rely on something else. Now, they might also have tradition in some fashion going for them, but being a charismatic figure just is like another big important thing. And I think you see that in a number of these leaders, particularly, I mean, not that I follow all these guys, but I think Trump, Nigel Farage, arguably, Millet, I mean, from what I've seen, I don't understand Spanish, but seems, definitely a character. And so charisma tends to go with populism because it's going against that other source of legitimacy. So you need some other source. And so charisma is one, and so charisma can work. But on the other hand, I don't think that like all charismatic leaders necessarily are populists. Like I would call Obama charismatic, even in a native sense. Like in the, as an individual person, just natively, or Bill Clinton. Everyone said he's just like charming, and like he's going to win you over. Some people just have more of a native charisma. And so it's not like charisma implies populism, nor even do I think that populism implies charisma, but I think there's a strong correlation. So I think that's kind of interesting. And I think it's interesting how Weber, just talks about legitimacy, because it is a question of legitimacy. And when our institutions have become so corrupt and depraved as they have, we see this very interesting phenomenon that's been going on now, for 10 years, more openly, of personality and challengers from tradition, including ideas, creedal traditions, really trying to stand up against this first source of legitimacy. So I thought that was kind of useful.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, sometimes we have to be careful about survivor bias. The people we wind up seeing in certain places, we attribute charisma to them because they are there, mm-hmm. See them a lot and whatnot. And so
that's why I say native charisma. I totally agree with that. Someone who takes power by virtue of being focal and powerful accrues a kind of charisma, but not necessarily a native charisma.
Right, no doubt. I'm not quite on the Obama charisma bandwagon. I know everybody else is. I think I think he presented something that kind of grooved right down the bowling alley of what people wanted at the time. And so I think if he had been, more shaped like, John McCain physically, ethnically, culturally, like, if you somehow could switch their brains and leave their bodies and put McCain's, brain in Obama's, physiognomy, and ethnicity, and kind of like free pass against perceived racism that Obama was riding in 2007 and 8 and whatnot. I think you'd have a different situation. So I don't really know, because I think Obama, absent a teleprompter, if you find those rare speeches when he speaks off the cuff, he's kind of stumbling, stuttery kind of guy. I don't think he has the formulation of genuine charisma off the cuff kind of stuff. I think it kind of falls for me. I think it's as per Groucho Marx. Once you can fake sincerity, you've got it made. I think. I think that's actually reasonably on point with Mr. Obama. But I will give you a Bill Clinton, and back in the day when dinosaurs trod the earth, and I was an undergraduate, I met Jimmy Carter twice while he was running in I guess that was 1976, and I thought he was charismatic. He was personable. He looked you right in the eye. I think the strongest drug on earth, it's retroactive, we don't get to have it again, is a mother's love. And so there's probably two classes of people. I did a lot of narcotic de-addiction treatment and whatnot. And if I had to make a divining rod like Harry Potter's sorting hat, J.K. Rowling's, I would say that people who had the foundational principle of love by their mom, are less likely to go into the servitude to drugs and whatnot. And so the people who are able to kind of make that contact with you on a human basis and not give you your mother's love, but give you that recognition of listening to you and paying attention to you, making you feel important, while obviously they're the politicians, they are the ones who are important. Those people have that gift, have that charisma. So you have Michael Dukakis on one side. I don't think he had that. He was supposed to be a technocrat. He was pushed that way and whatnot. I think we see certain kind of machine candidates, and those are the ones that kind of get pushed into the machine, and supposed to turn into our sausage and whatnot, and that's genuine grade A ingredients.
I appreciate all that, and I follow you. But let me just add that, I think both Obama and Trump illustrate the idea that charisma doesn't mean everybody's going to like you, but it means that some people you can really connect with and really appeal to, kind of from being you. And it might really turn off some other people, but how politics is about 51%. So some of them are like you said, some of that 51% are, like you said, just like the right time and the right message and so on, the right imaging in front of the camera. But I do think that, a lot of people find Obama, or at least did find Obama, extremely. He was really quite a phenomenon. Never to me, but I kind of saw how dangerous he was because of this at the time. Absolutely. I would say. So so charisma doesn't mean everybody loves you, but you can speak to a very substantial people in this charisma. You can reach or connect with
Was George McGovern a populist?
I don't know enough to say. I was 10 years old, and maybe better. But
well, there's some people who seem to just kind of brush in on this wave of quasi-populist support, like Jimmy Carter. Getting back again, I know these are dark ages references, but they came in without, and even Obama came in without necessarily the approval of the establishment of his party. Now it's the Democrat Party, and I think they anneal and maybe Neil as well better. So they coalesce better than the Republicans, were more like trying. They're wandering cats. And so it's hard to herd cats, and
yeah.
Democrats have this strength. So I think it's almost impossible to have a genuine populist candidate unless maybe Bernie Sanders, and he kind of raged against the machine and didn't get it. So and I agree with you that there are kind of personality traits that sometimes can be rough mean, I'm not sure you said this specifically, but a lot of people don't like Trump's personality. I would vote for him, but for his personality. But in order to get that kind of person who's willing to go against the grain and put all of his appendages out there on the line on the chopping block, you need a certain person who's willing to do that kind of stuff and take risks and whatnot. And that's not necessarily everybody. And sometimes that can be abrasive because those, most of the time they're guys.
Yeah.
Most of the time they're guys who are, want to be king of the hill, and on some level, are say potent characters, and we think of those in the sports scene and whatnot, who kind of take up the scene, kind of fill up the camera and whatnot. And those are not necessarily the people you want to have, I don't know, as a life partner and whatnot. The Golden State Warriors, big run, they had stars, but they really also had Draymond Green, who's kind of a bleep hole. I think he's a kind of an abrasive, meme centered guy, but lots of personality, and he's able to kind of affect those around him with an ethics. Kevin Garnett before that, speaking of basketball, probably not somebody that you'd want your sister to necessarily marry. I don't know for a fact, but, it's like you have to have that bigger than that people with a vision who can kind of be the lightning rod for a lot of criticism.
Yes,
they don't care. They let that stuff water off the duck's back.
Absolutely. And the sports analogy is also great. I neglected to say that this person then also becomes a source for a basis for coordination of the movement towards its goals. It does not have the coordination from the norms of the institutions, because this person's challenging the institutions, even attacking the institutions. So you need some other basis for coordinating, kind of the messaging, the actions, the activities of this movement, mobilizing. And so the personality, just like on a sports team, a lead personality, a dominant personality can be that. And we see that clearly in Trump, and I think in others. You might, in terms of other personalities that other politicians who might qualify. I mean, sometimes Maloney, I think, has been called a populist, and then you might call Thatcher to some extent. She was a mix because she was also had tradition, I think, behind her. Mm-hmm. But she also is an interesting personality to consider.
Well, I think she's a populist because, when you say tradition, she might have, genuine, older British tradition. But as we've seen in the UK, there's this undertow, an erosive undertow, I think, that is, globalist, whatever. So, nobody likes the nationalist, I guess. Nationalism is supposedly bad, but everything, like the two data scientists that go down the streets, like, hey, how are you? It's like, compared to what? And most everything is in comparison. So, nationalism better than tribalism, but I think nationalism is also better than globalism. So on either side, you kind of have this meta equilibrium where nationalism
absolutely
that gives the people enough potency and power, so they're not subsumed to something that becomes their, when they just become wagged by some bigger tail. I mean, I'll give you one quick example. I apologize. No. When I was in the before times, I call it, pre-COVID, when we actually had networking parties. I mean, they're coming back. Maybe 2017 or 2018. I happened to be in this cocktail party, and it was sponsored by Catalonia, not Spain, but Catalonia. And they have it spelled differently from the way we spell, and they've got the Enyes, whatever. And so they're so proud to be Catalan. And I wound up talking with the, I don't know, consulate or whatever. I'm not sure what ambassadorial role he had because it's not a true nation state. Anyway, so I asked him to kind of lay me out the plan. So, like South Park, I don't know if you ever see the underwear gnomes. There's part one, collect underwear. Part 3, make billions of dollars. All they're missing is the middle one. Anyway, so I'm like, okay, so part 1, you're clamoring for Catalonia. Part 3, you're Greater Catalonia. Okay, great. So what happens then? What's he says? Well, we want to join the EU. Like, okay, so you spend all this time, like a century, right, for proto-nationalism, and all you want to do is subsume it to Brussels. Like, what? Well, so you can have your own little guy there. Basically, I think it's just to give them a conduit so they can get their kind of foie gras, get their own patent, by the flow of corn and whatnot from Brussels, and as opposed to being Catalan. Like, all you wind up doing is having the mutual border, to the east from Syria, whatnot, with Greece, and you're just, you've lost everything. So you're no longer Spain, but you're not Catalonia either. And so, I think there's kind of this natural tendency, the concept of greed is bad. Well, everyone's got it, and really a matter of channeling it. Milton Friedman's like, well, your greed is bad, but what about my greed's good? Your greed's, so everyone has that. It all comes down to kind of a systems formulation. And so here's the question. Back in the Eisenhower era, this a blob, say, I'm not saying there was never a blob. I think every government has its blob and it has its state actors. And so long before, you may not, a lot of people may not realize, but the internet wasn't around then, and people didn't have X, and so where they didn't really chat about this stuff, in normal parlance, man on the street wanted. But so there's somebody controlling all this stuff. There's always going to be some man behind the curtain, wizard of one type or another. And so I think it skewed more conservative at that time. I think the FBI, we always thought as kind of, we're both wearing ties, kind of button down tie wearing whatnot. They probably still wear some of them ties and whatnot, but they've been mutated. They've been, subsumed by a different kind of virus. So I think they've had an infection that's come from the left. So now they are woke. Is in this case, the woke the same as whatever was running around then? Or is there kind of, can you make value judgments of whether there's better and worse types of blobs?
Well, this is a point that Benz makes exactly. He says they went from being anti-communist to anti-populist. The blob and and their revilement. So it is like they went left. And Benz even says, I'm not even saying I'm anti-blob. I'm just anti like what this blob is doing now. He says the blob used to promote free speech. Like that's how they used to do political influence abroad. Or it was part of it. Of course, they also had all these dirty tricks, but they also did promote, at least in some cases, actual free speech against repressive governments, commie governments and so on. Mm-hmm. And who wants commies? I mean, on the other hand, I don't really believe in the our government doing this, any of this particularly. Although I am kind of realistic about it in a John Mearsheimer's kind of way about what's going to happen and so on. I mean, you can't expect it to just be zeroed out. So yeah, you're right. The nature of the blob has changed, I think, and it's gone more woke. We know that it's gone, woke within the IC. John Gentry, a friend of mine, has written about this. He published a book about it recently, about the wokeification of the intelligence community. He's from the CIA, and in terms of his previous career. And, it's in the military, it's in everything. It's like John Brennan and Clapper and those kind of guys. And Obama, it's a big Obama achievement.
Right. Yeah. So can we make a judgment that anti-commie is better than woke?
Yeah. Like being anti-commie is better than being pro-commie.
So why is that? Why is that?
Because commie is bad. Because commie is bad.
Isn't this size? Something like saying the Jets versus the Patriots. Lots of people the Jets.
No, it's not. No, governmentalization is a sham and a menace by and large. And leftism is more governmentalization of social affairs. They're in denial about that. They're also in denial about how governmentalization sucks, how bad it sucks and how reliably it sucks. But that's what I believe.
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of evil step parents. I think we all understand what that's possibly like. And we spend a lot of our time, we have our formative years and then we kind of venture out on our own and then we expect to be able to do stuff. Like I, may not be able to afford, I don't know, the Mercedes or whatnot, but I can get this and I kind of pick out the car and I decide the color and whatnot. And, in our Soviet paradises, they don't quite really get that. They don't have the ability. And no. most of the times that everything's kind of being restricted. I think these ULEZ, they have the big eyes and the cameras in the UK. They're supposed to do congestion zones, and when they're kind of done with that, with London, they're moving out to the little towns, so you get the 15-minute cities and whatnot. And so you finally got your car, you finally picked out the color, but you can't drive it. It always seems to be like the revenge. It's not revenge of the nerds. Maybe it is a little bit nerdy.
It is.
It's revenge of this kind of evil stepmom. It's smarmy, kind of maternalistic.
And if you don't like worship them, kind of bow to them, heel to them, like that's actually what they don't like. I think that's why they don't like some of these other politicians, because they are not going to be subjugated and be tools of that blob group, and now lefty blob group, who is so in denial, so vain, so like you were saying, once you've learned how to fake sincerity,
or something like this. He says once you learn how to fake sincerity, you've got it made. But you can use that for humility, integrity, honesty. So pretty much. But I'm not sure which word he used, and I'm not sure he said it, but it's in my mind that way. So I got a separate question for you. Was Macron a populist? I mean, he had this kind of wave of.
I don't think of him that way at all. I think of him as very much a globalist.
I understand that, but he came in on his own party. It was neither of the standard parties. So kind of let me just kind of reframe the question a little bit. Everyone wants to be non-binary, or not everyone, but some slice the population. But pretty much everything is binary. You getting back to football, you go to the Super Bowl, and if you have the Chiefs versus the 49ers, and you come in wearing, God forbid, a Jets jersey, hoping the Jets will win, they didn't make it to the Super Bowl. So this is what I have a problem with, the third-party candidates, and I think RFK wisely withdrew and leveraged that kind of like, skunk in the punch bowl kind of aspect. But there's kind of a binary aspect. So two-party system for most of these work, and otherwise you get this mess. The parliamentary systems where you have these multi-parties and the kind of the squeaky wheel can get the grease, like in Israel. But you get kind of factional parties that get more power because they are the last nail in your home. They're the keystone when you collected all the bricks, and you need that one to make your coalition. So they wind up with outsized power. But generally speaking, I think the more functional democracies or constitutional republics have this binary system. Now, the two parties don't remain the same. We had the Whigs, we had the Federalists, we had the Democrat Republicans. Now we got the Democrats and the Republicans, whatever. And so in the UK, there might be kind of this morphing, and other countries as well. I mean, Macron formed his own party. I think Millet might have his own party, and these kind of move around. What's kind of like in the mix? How foundational, say, are the current formulations here and or in other countries, and what happens? How do you birth a new movement?
I don't know, but let me just say though that someone who didn't come from the two major wings or parties isn't necessarily therefore a populist. They also have to be talking populist about corrupt institutions and elites and establishment, and we're going to reform this, and they're enriching themselves. And I'm not sure Macron ever did that. Did he? I mean,
no, I was just putting him out as kind of a counter example for somebody who did forge a party. He did manage to get his own party up there, and I'm not sure they have parliamentary power anymore anyway. But it's kind of an oddity.
He may have been a globalist guy all along.
No doubt. I'm not. I think he's kind of a toady, but that's just how I run. But Bill Clinton is in his first term. He got in because of populism, but not necessarily his own, but because of Ross Perot's. And so sometimes populism.
But that was just that was a spoiler effect.
Go against the grain. Well, yeah, it happens in the UK. Everyone kind of sat on his hands in the last election. The right, because they were so off-pissed with the Conservative Party that they wound up getting clubbed. And it's not I think it came down to like some minimal number of actual voters, whatever. They always come up with these quasi statistics, but in a first bat by the gate molecular election through the various districts in the UK, you can win the whole place with 20% of the vote. That apparently that's what happened, or 20% of the populace allowed vote, and so they're now they're kind of stuck with the socialists or the Labor Party for the next 5 years if they want to stick around, which is kind of a big club over your head. And so, what would you kind of see on the horizon for populist movements? What are the likelihoods of success? Are you able to gauge that, or what?
Oh, I don't know. I guess I feel like there's some wind in their sails at the moment, certainly, and
Mhm.
I'm hoping for success. I do think Bolsonaro's better than Lula and Trump's better than Biden and so on. Um, I'm not good at the future.
Fair enough. There's a Danish proverb: "Amongst all things difficult to predict, the future is the hardest."
Yeah.
But let's
Yeah,
touch.
econometricians, kind of adapted this saying. I don't know if it's from Yogi Berra. Predictions are hard, especially about the future.
Oh, yeah, same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I researched that for my book. So getting to Brazil, I mean, we see what happens.
yeah,
It seems to me that it's always the case amongst the kind of Soviet, they have kind of I'm just making this word up, a molassesization of society. Everything gets thick and gooey. You can't do do stuff. You can't. They want to get rid of free speech. They want to get rid of X. You can't. There's a great movie
yeah,
about East Germany, The Life of Others. Oddly enough, it's Berlin, right across. You basically whisper, and radio waves can kind of travel. And they can see ostensibly the world of the West. And the big lie under socialism is they're in a paradise. So what they have to do is negate any other type of word or thought that there might be a competing system better. And so, we see this with any kind of monopoly. You kind of like have to crowd out and shout out the other one. When the NFL, was around, the AFL came along, they tried to shout it out. Eventually, they subsumed and bought them out. And I think there was the WFL, now there's the XFL, whatever. But the idea is to kind of keep them out of the picture.
Mm-hmm. And they use coercion, which the WFL, I mean, unless they have the government doing their bidding, they can't do.
Yeah. So with these kind of sports analogies, there was the WHL. Eventually, like the AFL, they got subsumed into the bigger league, and then everyone's happy again. So I kind of see this as a model, kind of this morphing model.
Yeah, but again, coercion's a big difference. I wouldn't just make a parallel with the voluntary, tendencies, because there, I think competition, if people are allowed to compete without being coerced against competing, like there's a lot of benefit and opportunity to compete. But they've got coercion, they twisted Elon's arm, and he cried uncle apparently to some extent with X in Brazil, right? And they're persecuting people. They're persecuting Bolsonaro. They're persecuting their opponents. They're just being, bastards.
So I think Churchill said socialism is the longest, most difficult, deadly path between capitalism and capitalism.
That's a very good one. That's a great one.
Yeah. You're in Sweden, and everyone thinks of Sweden as the great socialist model, and I think Bernie Sanders still thinks that, and it's not. In my understanding, It's not. I had on Lou Perez, and he did a video, actually totally out of the blue. He hired my son. I didn't even know my son did this. But the actual Swedish model. So insofar as you can exit from socialism, I don't think you can exit from deep socialism, communism. I think various Kims one, Kim 1, Kim 2, and Kim 3 make that very clear. North Korea, Castro 1, Castro 2. I'm not sure what was leading Cuba. I think once you're totally in, you've got these cement blocks around your feet. You can't leave communism. But I think Sweden didn't quite had not quite sunk. Or they had not been put the weights around their body. They somehow swum out because they had enough free speech and so forth to get out of it. Maybe you can talk I guess proactively about what Sweden told us about socialism, what they told us about getting out of it, and where Sweden is now, and what are Sweden's I guess plans and regrets.
I can answer. I can take a stab at that. I don't want people to think that I'm some kind of expert on this, but I definitely think I know something about it. In 1960, although the Social Democratic Party had been quite dominant, I think, for some decades and then continued to be dominant, in 1960, I don't think the Swedish tax load was very high at all, and the extent of the government was very high at all. And then it accelerated aggressively and in a very bad way in the 60s, and then I'd say especially the 70s into the 80s. So, and Sweden prior to 1960, let's say for at least 60 years, like grew under free enterprise, I think you can fairly say, fairly free enterprise, a quite liberal era, very rapidly from a very poor country to a quite rich country. And so, and they come from a Lutheran, and it's a small group of singular language speakers, no one else except for some people in Finland speaks Swedish. So it's very much a Club Sweden, extended family kind of situation. And so what I'm saying is that Sweden very much has deep roots in, if you like, liberal civilization and classical liberal foundations, Northern Europe, Protestant classical liberal foundations. So then they get their kind of leftism, very strong, aggressive, foolish leftism, which I don't really think the Social Democratic Party was that badly prior to 1960, into the 60s, 70s, 80s. And that's bad. And it doesn't go well by the end of the 80s and into the 80s. And then there's a very strong reaction. Sweden has a very interesting cultural, socio-cultural world where I do think there's kind of an operating central zone of influence and people who matter. That central zone expression is Edward Shills, a sociologist from Chicago, died maybe 20 years ago. And that central zone kind of, got up its back and pushed back. And there was real reform in the opposite direction in the 90s, especially after a financial crisis. And so Sweden has been, rethinking the aggressive 2 decades, you could say 2-3 decades it had with leftism, and just never became that bad. In terms of economic regulation, it's not as heavily regulated actually as the US. It does have a collective agreements labor market, which is very different and complicated, and you can't call free enterprise. But generally speaking, like something like occupational licensing is very light by American standards, just as an example. And just like governance and regulation in general, it's just not as insane and unworkable and unreasonable. It's kind of like the people imposing these rules and talking about them are like the third cousins, if you will, of the people who are suffering under them.
Right.
Up until recently, Sweden was Swedes, like about 8 million Swedes. Now there's about 10 million people in Sweden. So I'm just saying there's a lot of things to it. It's not socialist because it's always had big private and effective private industry. It did have nationalizations, but many of those were reversed in the 90s. A very open economy in terms of international trade. So it's a mixed bag. They do things like school vouchers. They don't do it that well, but they do have national school vouchers. Some privatization of the pension system. So it's an interesting place. It's not just a socialist, but it does have a big tax load.
Yeah.
It's not that progressive, the basic tax structure. I mean, people are expected to work.
Right. So I'm gonna switch continents for a second.
Sure.
This comes up a lot with otherwise credentialed and knowledgeable people where they don't think Venezuela is a socialist country, and it kind of brings up two threads. I mean, Hugo Chavez, was he a populist? Or I don't know if he took power by populism. I think he got a vote originally, but it's kind of like the one man, one vote, one time kind of concept. Is Hamas populist? Was Hitler populist? Mussolini?
I think Hitler was populist.
So where do these things go bad? What are the checks and balances? And is social, is Venezuela a socialist country? And was it populist and so forth? And how do we kind of, pick the good from the bad?
I don't know a lot about these countries either, Randy. I mean, they say Venezuela's populist, and I think the politicians and government have talked that way. That's partly how we identify these things when they talk this stuff. But I think we know Venezuela is quite bad.
Yeah, no, I think they're a socialist country. They nationalize stuff. They
right.
They put their kind of own, kind of socialist leaning foot soldiers. They got rid of all the people running the Venezuelan oil and whatnot. They got rid of the German engineers and whatnot. They kicked them out of the country. They put all their cronies in, and then nobody knows how to run anything. It's it's hilarious. I mean, it's sort of hilarious if it weren't so sad. And they took over the apparatus, but without, it's kind of like Woody Allen's Bananas, if you remember that movie.
Yeah.
So they take over, but they don't have any of the skills with which to do so. And of course, they wind up blocking the voting booth, which is something that's, if you can't, you can't. I don't think you can remain a populist if you're no longer popular and willing to let people know you're no longer popular. So Maduro,
right,
was I don't know if Chavez's crony, a bodyguard or driver or friend or whatever it was. He was not a politician per se, but he's there, and he's kind of a man of the people in that sense, but won't allow actual real votes, and then wind up vilifying and imprisoning any possible contenders and lawfaring them off the ballot. I don't know if you ever heard of that kind of thing happening, where people
yeah, but that's playbook so many places around the world among the leftists and the globalists. They're raping democracy in so many places. This fits into the whole regime change, deep state. What's happened in Romania recently? You heard about that?
I missed it.
This is my understanding. I'm pretty confident about it, that this guy Georgescu was poised to win. He's like against the globalist Project Ukraine type stuff, which is super important for that whole project. I think NATO plans its biggest military base in Romania, and he was going to win. And so a court there said the election's canceled because of Russian interference on TikTok, which was just total bullshit. It's known
it's
and
amazing
kind
how
of proven.
These bad ideas get retreaded.
Exactly. It's the same. It's the same. Like
really
Russia, go to Russia, evil Russia, Russia. Hunter Biden laptop, everything else. And they tried regime change operation recently in Georgia, but for the moment that's failed. They're now working, they're working all over the place. And they're raping democracy in the name of protecting democracy. Because, Russia was interfering on TikTok.
That's an incredible thing. So we're kind of rounded out a little bit of our hour here, but if I can keep it just for a couple of minutes, you recently, I guess a couple of days ago, interviewed Jeffrey Sachs. What did you gain or learn from that?
That was fun, and he was very kind and generous about doing the whole thing, so I'm very grateful to him. It is posted at YouTube at Glenn Deason's channel, if you want to watch it, and also it's going to be up in audio at Econ Journal Watch, which I edit. So I would say the hour with Sachs was kind of divided into two segments, roughly equal segments. And the first one, I talked to him about being an economist, because, it's for Econ Journal Watch, and we're both nominally economists. I say nominally for my own part. And so I talked to him about being an economist, who are his favorite economists, who were his mentors, what does he think of the econ profession today, and so forth. And that was all great. And, it's not like I've heard a lot of Jeff Sachs, and I really am grateful to Jeff Sachs for everything that he's saying on the Duran and on Judge Napolitano. Not that I necessarily agree with every single thing, but I'm grateful. But so I talked to him about things you don't hear him talk about, in his regular material, professional stuff. So in the second half, I wanted to probe him on foreign policy and in particular Russia, and this theme that we've started touching on a little bit about hatred of Russia and Russia as a scapegoat and a rationale for the whole hegemonist, as I call it, kind of program of the globalists or whatever. I use these terms, the word like globalists, because you don't know what to call. You don't even know exactly who they are. So we talked about why first of all, I asked him, do you believe that, the globalists, as it were, have an aim of regime changing and breaking up Russia? And he said, yes, of course they do. And then he talked some about why that's unjust, like to have that aim. And then we talked about what animates this unjust aim that they have.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a number of things that he proposed there that all made sense to me. So the second half of it's about like that stuff.
Yeah, interesting. I've seen him with Tucker Carlson and others,
Mm-hmm.
and he goes. I mean, there's been I think Russia post-Soviet. It's kind of an irony that the Democrats kind of love the Soviet Union. They always seem to align with the Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union fell, they seem to go against Russia. The kind of, I guess, quasi rump state of the Soviet, whatever. It's kind of, and I think early on, they wanted to be part of the system. They wanted to be, economic, free enterprise aligned and whatnot. And I think they've clearly moved a lot in that direction from where they were. I was behind the Iron Curtain back in 1987 throughout East Europe, and that world is people, frankly, everybody who's a socialist should spend some time hanging out. I think there are a few bastions or prisons of such ilk still around, North Korea, etc. But it's just kind of odd that they got such pushback when they were reasonably accommodating throughout the 90s and whatnot. And
yeah,
I think a lot of their pleas were put on deaf ears. I don't know. I think maybe in part we needed I don't know if you ever, again, another sports analogy, but in basketball, the big center will be hunkering down at the block and trying to go for a little kind of hook layup or something like that, and the other center's pushing up against them, and so forth. Every now and then they pull the chair away. The guys up there, I can kind of see Rasheed Wallace doing this or whatever. He's up there, and the other guy, Shaquille or whatever, is ready to and Wallace will step back, and the big guy just falls on his butt. You need that in order to have your thing. You kind of need the resistance, and so it seems to me like there's a fair amount of the need for the military requires an enemy.
Exactly, and a scapegoat, and that gets into what animates this. Maybe they want to steal Russia and other countries like Ukraine's resources. Maybe it's just all a grift of the MIC going, that money going in every direction, including 10% for the big guy.
Yeah.
And just the vanity of this hegemonism that we were talking about. Like, if you're not loving and worshiping me and elevating me and respecting my sense of self-worth, like, you're bad and need to be, broken up. I mean, so it's yeah, but I agree. I mean, that does seem to be the situation, but it's kind of like fundamentally after, in the 21st century, Russia is not Cold War Soviet Union. And why are they even acting like competing centers on the basketball court? Why aren't they just like more just friends, right? Why aren't they on the same team?
Yeah,
I don't really believe.
I think the underlying point of globalism is woke. I think the countries that get pushed back against are like Hungary and Poland and whatnot for not wanting here's a technical term, the smushization of the world.
Just the moral rot. Like, they see the moral rot of the left and the globalists, and they reject it.
I know.
I think
It's
often.
a funny thing. We when we had an embassy in Kabul, we put up the rainbow flag, literally, next to the American flag, or maybe above it. Who knows? But I'm sure it was. I'm pretty sure it was up there based on pictures, presuming they were correct. And this is an odd thing, because the funny thing is we are so willing to go out on a limb posturing for the pride flag, and in a place where what you're going to get is much worse. You're going to get something, the action reaction. I mean, I'm not sure how, a lot of things at play in Syria with Iran and whatnot, but Bashar Assad was not necessarily going to be the basher that comes in, from the Al Qaeda types. ISIS types are going to take over, and so this preservation of minority rights is nice, but what you wind up is pushing too hard for kind of the kind of takeover of minority rights over that sensibility, morality of the majority. What you wind up with is a harsher reaction. So you wind up with Islamism taking over in Afghanistan, when we didn't present any kind of reasonable formulation of what colonialism should have been, such as the British did pretty well for a couple centuries and whatnot. Mm-hmm. I think we become kind of corrupted colonialists, and I'm not sure the U.S. should be moving into a lot of places, because we don't necessarily have kind of the vision of providing something better than what is necessarily local.
Agreed. It's all, the whole unipolarity, like that fits in with the hegemonism. If you they're still trying to maintain unipolarity in everything. So they need to take down the other great powers like Russia and China.
Yep, it's a funny thing, huh?
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of rounding out our hour here, and I want people to know who you are. So I'm going to see if I can put up your picture, and people can find various aspects about you. Here you are, Daniel B. Klein, and this is at
Mason.
Yeah, GMU, George Mason University, and they can find your other missions and so forth here, as well as
I'm not very adept at all that, but I need to build a new website. But thanks for this.
Yeah, and so they've got some of your books here, Smithian Morals, and I assume it's not the rock band, the Smiths, you're talking about there.
No.
So Adam Smith, the Virtuous Circle, and if people want to help support my video cast, they can buy my book. This is self-promotion here. We'll come back to you in a second. But this is Zika, overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was, unrelated to any topic we've talked about here, but it helps kind of power my mission and so forth.
Probably not so unrelated.
Huh. Well, it's got a lot of Brazil in it.
There you go.
Well, I've learned a lot of Brazil, but I got to tell you, they pushed back against. I mean, it's related insofar as if Zika had been uncovered for the, Zika is a real virus. It's a dengue virus. And microcephaly is a real but very rare phenomenon. It's like saying dwarfism or something like that. And the only question is whether one A caused B, and it just hasn't been that way anywhere, including probably Northeast Brazil at the time, 2015. But the way it was kind of like sprinkle in globalism and a lot of woke ideas. I mean, this actually, it's interesting you say that. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it sort of suffuses the narrative. What happened was this thing happened. Let's say scientists made a mistake. Okay, fine. It could have just died away. But people on the left were so thrilled that there was a thing that caused microcephaly in babies. Why? That's grotesque. That's macabre. Why would they be thrilled? Well, because Brazil has statutes against abortion. And so in order to overthrow those immediately by fiat, by judicial decree, they kind of politics and whatnot, emergency abortions. So they wanted this thing not to go away in Brazil. And then various kind of aligned physicians kind of piped in that this was a good opportunity to make, have a moratorium on birth. So there were efforts to have zero births until there could be a Zika vaccine. Mind you, it's 2025, a decade later, and there's been no Zika vaccine. So they'd be waiting. There'd be nobody in elementary school anywhere in Latin America if these people had had their wishes. So in Honduras and parts of Colombia and states within Brazil, there were efforts to have this moratorium on birth. So, people say that leftism is a death cult. I'm not the person who said that, but there are certain aspects that do, kind of it sort of rhymes a little bit.
And you got this apparatus of gaslighting, swampiness. Yeah. And so it probably does relate to these other projects of theirs.
My kind of counterfactual replay of history would be if there had been a slapdown of Donald McNeil, the New York Times, Tom Frieden, Fauci, Obama era, and so forth, kind of this kind of push, because this was all tied in with climate stuff. They're saying all these tropical illnesses are going to affect the whole world.
So Fauci was in on this too?
Oh yeah. He actually,
there you go. See, it's very related.
He willingly volunteered that he stole funds from cancer and diabetes research to push onto Zika before it had been even approved by Congress. I think that's a crime. But he basically leveraged the money. He said, I'm taking this money away from this to putting to Zika anyway. So you got to pass the bill so you can get the money back into the diabetes. So I don't see how they get away with that stuff, but there you have it. And there was a woke aspect here because of the abortion stuff, Zika funding didn't go through quickly until September 2016, when the thing had already died away. No pun intended. But and because the Republicans in Congress didn't want to fund pro-abortion stuff in Brazil, and that's what the essence was. So the money got funneled into NGOs and so forth. You kind of know the story; it gets played out over and over again.
Cool, Randy. I hope to catch up with you again in New York. That was great getting together.
No, this was fabulous. Enjoy Svenska, Sweden, and hope to meet up with you again soon. I want you to just hang around a little bit because we want to chat afterwards, but I'm going to end this for today. Thank you so much, Professor Daniel Klein.
Thank you, Randy.